But hello and welcome to the Australian College of Physical Education's latest Monday Night Coaches Club. My name's Gareth Long. This is the 7th one. So we're quite pleased that we've got to 7. What started as something to try and help coaches in the lockdown is becoming a regular thing, and we certainly hope to be able to continue it going forward. So a big thank you, especially to everyone that turned out on Wednesday, and again everybody that helped create our COVID-safe coaching resource. Hopefully everybody received that, but please reach out to me if you haven't received it yet. But perhaps check your junk mail first. We're loving the conversations and the collaboration happening in the breakout rooms. So please stick around for those. The feedback we're getting is that they're really, really valuable, really useful to be able to chat to people like yourselves, just from different parts of the country and the globe. So we'll be putting you into breakout rooms again today to discuss today's topic. Also, really appreciate the number of emails that I received from coaches really enjoying the content and the format of the webinars. People don't have to do that, so thank you very much for that. As I said at the beginning, put the questions in the chat function and also answer the questions. I think my catchphrase is fast becoming that there's a wealth of experience in the audience as well as on the panel, and I know I need a better catchphrase, but please pick people's brains and share your thoughts and expertise in there. So as usual, before we start, I'd like to introduce my two co-hosts for today. Firstly, our chief summariser today is Warren Grieve. How you doing, Warren?
Very well, thank you. Very well.
Good stuff, mate. And monitoring the chat, being on top of the chat and sparking conversation in the chat function will be our DJ, Chris Adams. How's it going, Chris?
Going very well, Gareth. Going very well. Cold and wet, but going all right.
Yeah, we should tell everyone in the UK that it's a wet and windy Sydney today, and I've had a look on the weather, and it's a lovely morning in the UK. So you win this one. Well done. But so yeah, welcome to everybody along. Really looking forward to our panel today. But for those people that are new, we tend to do this in 4 sections. We'll have Q&A with our panel to start with. We'll go into the breakout rooms, which I've already mentioned, for 10 minutes. And then you really drive the webinar. So Chris will be selecting questions from the chat room that you've put in there. And, we'll see what direction we go off on. Today's a massive topic, so we'll see what direction we go off to. And then for those that like to stick around for the little bit extra, we'll have extra time, 10 minutes, where we can continue that discussion for whoever stays around. Okay. So look, the topic today is identifying and developing talent. Probably we've got the title of this webinar wrong. It probably should be identifying players with potential and developing talent. We need to acknowledge this is a big area and a complex area, and we're not going to be able to cover all aspects of talent ID and talent development as it relates to football, but hopefully we can at least kickstart a discussion and generate some thoughts. So I'm looking forward to this panel because we've got probably this panel more than any of our other panels. We've got people from a real diverse background and experiences. So it's enough of me, and I'll introduce the panel now. First person I'd like to introduce is Jacob Naish. Jacob is the commercial director for FC Nordsjælland. That's my first attempt at it, and from now on they'll probably be known as the club from Denmark, but we'll go for FC Nordsjælland. The club are currently sitting 5th in the Danish Superliga, and for those who watched the video that we sent out, you'll see that the club has one of the youngest teams in professional European football and aims to win the league with a team solely consisting of academy graduates. So real fascinating club ambitions there that I'm sure Jacob will talk about. Prior to this role, Jacob was head of development at Fulham FC and head of community cohesion at Brighton Hove Albion FC. Jacob, welcome to the Monday Night Coaches Club. Oh, yeah, all right.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
Our pleasure, Jacob. Good to see you again. And secondly, Matthew Conning. Matthew is wearing 2 hats today, really. Before becoming a lawyer, Matthew completed a 2-year scholarship working towards a contract with a professional football club. Matthew's now a lawyer and a registered intermediary with the English FA. As part of the Crown Football Group, Matt and his team support the development of emerging talent and young professional players. Thank you for joining us, Matty, and welcome along.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Gareth.
No problem, mate. And finally, Drew Taylor. So Drew, as well as being an established part of the Monday Night Coaches Club, Drew's current role is as a player development manager, which requires him to lead a talent support program in New South Wales, supporting and developing talented young players, supplementing their current training and games program. How's it going, Drew?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. Looking forward to everything that comes out of this one. Like you said, it's a massive topic, but we'll see how we go in an hour or whatever we've got.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Drew. Okay, well, let's get started. I'm going to start with you, Jacob, if that's okay. And I know a lot of these questions are very broad, but I wonder if you can give us an insight into the player recruitment model at FC Northland.
Yeah, okay, great. So very briefly about me specifically, I'm not a football coach anymore, though I used to be many years ago when I first met Gareth, and I used to work in West Africa doing stuff around training football coaches to use football coaching to meet other social objectives. And that's kind of how I ended up, even though that was almost 15 years ago, it's kind of how I ended up doing what I'm doing right now, actually, at FC Northland, and that'll become clear soon. So I'm coming at this from quite a helicopter angle and about how we talk about our player recruitment and player development model at FC Northland and the wider group. So the way that we think about player recruitment is we're focusing on trying to find individuals that transcend being very talented footballers. They need to be much more than that in order to make it at our academy, and that's because of the goal of the overall group. So we're part of something called the Right to Dream group, which is Right to Dream is an organisation that has been running the most successful academy in Africa for the last 20 years. We've identified a bunch of really talented players, including people like Bertrand Traoré and Kaleki Iheanacho. And we have players now currently playing everywhere from Manchester City to Celta Vigo to Napoli to Sampdoria, Borussia Dortmund. They're playing, all over the world. A lot of them in the MLS as well, doing quite well. There are more pastoral players, if you like. I can explain a bit more about that too. But yeah, the goal of the organisation, as Gareth said, is to play and to win with a team made up entirely of academy graduates. And in order to do that, we need to go beyond purely footballing talent, and we need to find people who can conform really to three pillars. And those three pillars are people who we can educate to a really high level, people who we can develop their character and their behaviour traits to a really high level, and according to 7 core behaviour traits that we're looking to foster in our groups, and people who will obviously be technically and tactically and physically extremely strong footballers as well, so that they can make it. And to give you a little understanding of like where we position ourselves on that, the worst players from our academy, the least talented players, will usually be good enough to play in the MLS. They'll usually be good enough to play to get a soccer scholarship to a US university, and then many of them have played in the MLS after that. So that's the kind of that's the baseline that we're setting, above which we're kind of gunning for our success. The recruitment model is based really in well, it's actually almost, I think it's 8 countries now. The recruitment model is in 3 countries in West Africa: Ghana, Ivory Coast and Nigeria, and in all of the Nordic countries. And we're recruiting from all of those places. The need for us to find players has meant that we have had to get extremely scientific about how we tap into reservoirs of talent. So we use Google Maps, we use AI, we use computer programming essentially in order to find places where we have the highest likelihood of recruiting a really talented football player. And that is especially effective in places like West Africa, where we have a kind of competitive advantage because we know so much about how to recruit people from very poor areas. And that's been very successful for us so far, and it's led to us, as Gareth said, we've got one of the, I think we're in the top 3 youngest teams in Europe. As things stand, we're in the top 5 with number of minutes played by academy graduates. And there are some things around the unique style of play as well that I'll come to later when we talk about player development, that mean that we've also been very successful in kind of getting our philosophy through, you could say that. So yeah, that's just a little bit there about what's different about our recruitment model. And we're starting at 11 years old.
Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to you talking more about the player development later, and fascinated about Google Maps and AI. So maybe we, in the extra time, we might be able to ask some questions around the specifics of that. Really interested. Thank you, Drew. Following on from that, and I think, Jacob, you said you start at 11 years of age. Is that right?
Yeah, we start 11, but we begin pulling them into our Nordic Academy at 15. So between 11 and 15, they are housed within a network of cooperation clubs that we have here in Denmark. It's a very unique kind of model for how grassroots football feeds into professional football here. And there are actually 43 of those clubs. There's 17,000 players in total. So it means that in total each year, we're assessing in our player recruitment model a total of almost 40,000 players each year.
Okay, massive. So Drew, with that in mind, and your experience of talent ID in Australia and other countries, what are some of the things we need to consider in early talent ID and development?
So massive topic. So I guess sort of without wanting, potentially going into being a bit reductionist, but some main ones might be the difference between identification versus selection, current ability versus future potential, and then development as opposed to recruitment or replacement. So they're not necessarily opposed, any of those things, but they're not necessarily the same. So I guess some of the risks, if we go too early, and can be a result of a misunderstanding of some of the mechanisms that kind of underlie talent ID and development, is you start to get things like the relative age effect. So a lot more first quarter born players represented earlier, and certainly some of the work we've been doing here, or I've done, it shows that it's no different in Australia to what's coming out of like the Euro under 17s that Laura Finnegan did, or anywhere else in the world, around first quarters being overrepresented. And then as you go through the age groups, by the time you reach a senior level, it generally flattens itself out. And there's around the relative age effect, I guess, if you take a 10-year-old or an 8-year-old, if you're trying to, I guess, identify, select, and then develop players that age, if there's 10 months difference for Australia, between a January birth and a November, or I guess in the UK, you're going for sort of September through then it's more than 10% of their life. So some physical and cognitive elements that come into play there. And then they might have started, in terms of, we talked a couple of weeks ago around training age. So if a kid started going to do some things when they turn 3, then they're 11 months ahead of somebody that turns 3, 11 months older, despite the fact that they'll be age grouped in the same cohort and potentially going against each other at 6, 7, 8. So out of that, we potentially get some race for early specialisation, and particularly in countries like Australia, I think, where we've got sort of 4 football codes in every other sport, kind of competing for both participation and potentially performance. A drive, and some term at that race to the bottom. So people trying to get in younger and younger, and then that will up the training age, and then they might wind up in a program at an early age that you potentially don't come back out of, because you get retained within it because of that being then. So we've brought them in early, and then look at what development is being developed in those players, rather than the maybe 99% that were deselected during that selection process for a few. And then I think John O'Sullivan might have coined it, but somebody else may have, around the placeholder process. So you get something around there's a lot of evidence suggests that the later you come into an elite development program, the more chance you are to actually be in there. And the earlier you've come in, the earlier it potentially spits people out. So and then later, so once people go through that teenage years, so girls a bit earlier than boys, we start to see things like issues related to maturation. So the evidence is that there can be swings between or up to 2.5 years from a late developer, early developer, or online developers, and then that's the obvious stuff in terms of if you see a photo of like Romelu Lukaku at 15, he's like 6'1" and playing against people that are tiny, but there's also obviously the social and psychological development that people go through at the same age, and one 14-year-old's not going to be the same as another 14-year-old in a whole heap of different things. And I guess the other piece that comes into it when you get to the development stage is, rightly or wrongly, at some age, most clubs or coaches will start to say that results do matter now. So at what age do those results start to matter? Where does that then impact upon development, maybe going out the door to then recruit somebody that may in the short term get results, which might, certainly if you talk like national team level, there's some things like if you don't qualify for a tournament, say at the under 15s or 17s, that might be the end of your cycle, or that might impact on funding. So there's definitely some challenges you go through, and that might be for clubs as well around, well, do you need success to maintain whatever level it is that your club is at, or what it's perceived to be at, and how does that impact it? And then I guess the final bit is there's something around, well, there's this issue of the saying like talent needs trauma. So is there something around the ones that aren't being selected then come into the fore? Is part of the mechanism for them making it there actually that they weren't selected at an average age, so they've always been the younger one battling through to get in, and that starts to build some resilience or some psychological traits that may be important. And then it might be that ones that are in and have always been the best potentially aren't pushed through that ceiling. So I guess that's the counter argument, that maybe some of the things around early ID actually help some that aren't selected if they can overcome the challenges that they're faced. So there's the issues. I don't have the answers, but there's a few there to consider anyway.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I asked you, Drew. And you're right; it's a massive topic, and you've given us a good whirlwind tour of some of the things that are complex and thorny, and certainly not, and a little bit messy. So I appreciate that. And I don't want to hog the second half of the conversation later on, but I'd love to know your thoughts on Bayern Munich's apparent decision to cut, for want of a better word, their under 9s and under 10s academies. So I'll try and keep that in my mind, or if someone can put that in the chat, they can have that one as well. Brilliant, thanks, Drew. Maddie, obviously in your role, you're an advisor to a lot of emerging talent and young professional players. So I wonder if you could speak about how, as an advisor, you go about or would go about dealing with some of the things off the pitch that can potentially derail young talent.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. Firstly, I'm pleased to be invited to speak about some of our personal experiences working in the football industry. The football world can be quite a closed environment, and players and parents can sometimes feel lost and isolated without access to professional advice and support. So I'd like to speak a little bit about some of the potential obstacles that can come up on a player's journey, really, and how we can aim to enhance awareness to help players avoid some of those problems. And so, in answering the question, there are hours outside of the pitch where things can potentially go wrong, and sometimes these things are linked with such things as lifestyle interests of players. And particularly during the early phase of player representation, the parents are actually more central to the players' footballing decisions. What we tend to find is during the first and second professional contracts, we start to see some changes with the players beginning to take more control and ownership of the footballing decisions and career choices. So actually one of our primary roles as an advisor is educating the players and the parents and encouraging the right practices, particularly during the hours away from the club, really. So these can be simple things like ensuring that a young player is getting enough sleep and recovery. A former Premier League manager coached a number of our players, and he was really big on this, and he couldn't stress enough the importance of of sleep and recovery, on performance levels. So just to summarize a little bit, the experience that we work with is actually largely on education, and we do all we can to accommodate the needs of when we're working with young players. What we sometimes can find helpful is using case studies to help players make better choices. One of the other key roles that we do to help players on the journey is coordinating a team of professionals around the player to meet the player's needs, because ultimately and essentially it's the overall understanding of the player's needs that are really important, so that we can achieve our overall aspiration of making sure that a player is happy and fulfilled. So just to close off a little bit, our work involves managing what sometimes can be sensitive scenarios involving the player and sometimes also the club and sports brand. So we do introduce a wider team of specialists who are trusted and can understand the fast-paced nature of the work that we do in the football industry. And these can be lawyers or sports PR specialists, tax advisors, or even teams to manage social media platforms. And they can all be introduced at the right time to afford that additional layer of protection for players. So a few examples that I can think of over the years, we've worked as a company to help players in areas of defamation control. If a player is accused to have said something or done something allegedly that could potentially do damage to someone's reputation, but this can also affect the club and a player sponsor as well if he has one. We've also helped players in relation to allegations purporting to criminal offences, including assault accusations, and there can be disputes sometimes between players and also even players and coaches. In more extreme circumstances, we've worked with clubs to help players get the appropriate support with some addictions such as gambling, and this often leads to financial mismanagement as well, so we have to step in and provide the right support in this area. So overall, with the players and parents, if we start our work early enough, we can help prepare them in the right way. And the idea is that we help them stay motivated, and if they do stray from the path, we try and get them back on track, keeping a healthy balance between the social and the workplace. But overall, when we're adding value, it's down to the player at the end, because he's the one or she's the one that has to walk on the path of and do the job ultimately. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful in introducing a bit of the work that we do with players off the pitch.
Yeah, no, Matty, it's helpful in a number of ways. One, it gives us a really good insight into your role, which I must admit I had very little knowledge of, and obviously people that do similar roles to you. And also, I think it sort of shows that Jack Walton talked about a coach and some of the things that they can influence, some of the things that they might be able to influence, and some things that are out of the coach's control. And certainly that journey, that talent journey is probably not linear. There's probably ups and downs and twists and turns, and certainly a team of people are probably going to more likely support that young player or young professional on that journey. So that helps a lot. Thank you, Maddie. Jacob, I'll come back to you, and it's a similar question to the last one, but we're kind of moving from the recruitment to when you've got them and developing the players. So again, an insight into the player development model at FC Northumberland, please.
Yeah, sure. I'd actually like to pick up a little bit on some of the stuff that Matthew was just talking about, because
Brilliant, thank you.
I think my colleagues at the club and at the academy in Ghana would wildly agree with what Matthew's talking about, and about the importance of all of these things outside of the game to the player development model itself. And of course, this is about football coaching, and this group is for people that are interested in developing young, talented players. But a very difficult fact to accept, I'm sure you guys are well cognitive of it and aware of it, but it generally in football is just how fundamental these other things are to the success of the player. In fact, they're probably more important than talent development models themselves. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. Our our ability to control those other factors in young players' lives between 11 and 15 years old in Ghana is far bigger than our ability to do that in Denmark. And the reason why is our academy in Ghana is residential. And we make a long-term commitment to players who join there. If you're recruited at 11 years old and you're from the north of Nigeria, for example, the commitment we make to that player is till they are at least 15 years old. And in practice, very, very rarely do we say goodbye to a single player ever at that level. It's about 1% of players that actually go at 15 years old. They all stay in one form or another. So the players know two things there, and the parents know two things. And Matthew also mentioned parents and how important at that lower academy level in the player development model, how important the parents are to decision making. That tells the players, number one, they can focus on their game, they can listen to their coaches, they can really embed themselves in the playing philosophy and the style of play in order to develop into the player that they can be between 11 and 15. So they have that confidence, they know they can do that. But also we can actually control all of those external factors. And quite honestly, we do. We make sure that those things that can negatively influence players or pull their attention to other sides, that they are minimized. And that has a tremendous effect. It means that 40% of the players at 15 years old, when we at 15 years old, we basically split our academy model into two. One path goes on to a more educational model, and that usually ends up in top US schools or top US universities, and players can end up going into the MLS. And the other half go into what we call the international academy, which is the blending of the very best talent that we have in the Nordics and West Africa. We put them together. They get a very high standard of education so that if it doesn't work out, they can go and do other things. But about 40% of those players actually end up playing professional football. And if you compare that with the English academy model, where it's less than 1%, it's incredibly successful. And that's because we're controlling those factors. But of course, in Denmark, we can't control those factors in the same way. And so we see different kinds of issues coming in. And another thing that Matthew said, which I thought was a brilliant summary actually of how important these factors are to the player development model in general, is we have begun now, as we've matured over the last 20 years, we've begun to recruit more ex-professional players to become mentors to these young people. And even over the last 2.5 years, we've seen that kind of grow and become more and more important. And for me as a football coach, it's really interesting, kind of that full circle in player development models and academies. When I first started working at Brighton and Hove Albion, the noise at Brighton and Hove Albion was very much in the academy there to try to limit the effect of ex-professional football players on the academies, because people felt that it actually it was getting too much of a kind of old boys club, and they were limiting the number of experiences that players are having. I see that as slightly coming back full circle now, because it's not so much the fact that young players require pro players to develop their talents. It's so that they can be mentored in the correct way, so that they can travel the journey that these other professionals have traveled. It's much more of a kind of psychosocial thing. And I noticed there was a question in the chats here from Andrew Wilson, and about the importance of psychosocial and psychological skills. And for us, for Right to Dream and FC Northland, it's the most important thing by a million miles. And it involves kind of 60% of our organizational resources are put into that: character, education, and those two other pillars, really. So that really is like the total underpinning, the foundation of our player development model. That it is true to say that we have a very distinct style of play based upon 6 principles that all of the players have to learn, and that's very, very difficult for our players to learn. It's like it's very complex. You can tell I'm a little bit outside of football coaching, so honestly, I don't get it. But they do. Luckily, the players do. And our founder and chairman at the moment is very vocal about the requirement for He believes he has some he's very outspoken. His name's Tom Vernon. I encourage you to go onto LinkedIn and follow him. He's a very interesting guy, and he's one of the kind of trailblazers in the game at the moment. But he believes that at the moment, the way that elite academies in Europe are developing, they're essentially cutting out the rest of the game. And that he believes it's impossible for JJ Okocha, for example, to happen again. Because JJ Okocha didn't have a full elite academy education in Europe. He spent some of his earlier playing days in Africa. And because the tactical side of the game is so developed now and has developed so much over the last 8 years, especially in Europe, he believes that it's going to be virtually impossible to see these kind of more Latin American and African stories coming through at a later stage. People like Kanu and such arriving, as they're a little bit older into the game, because the level of education is so high now within the academies and how much they have to learn. But one thing I just wanted to tell about to kind of characterize our style of play before I just wrap up is that we are in the top 3 teams in Europe for average attacking position further up the field. I don't know, you can correct me if I've said that particular statistic. One of the coaches here, I'm sure, can correct me if I've said that particular statistic wrong, but essentially we are very far up the field in terms of our average attacking position taken up in terms of percentage of minutes of the game. So the entire philosophy and style of play is geared towards creating these situations. And it's very much a possession-based game. So that gives you an idea. Individual talent is super important, but it's very much around the team ethos as well, and that's quite a difficult thing to recruit for. And so the players, the coaches and scouts put a lot of effort into that.
Oh, thank you, Jacob. That's a really good insight. Really interesting about that 4 or 5 year commitment to a player and the benefits that brings to them. Mute someone there, or
I'm on it.
you on it? Thank you. Cheers, Chris.
I just want to add to that actually that we're working towards doing that in Denmark as well. But it's a lot more complex. We make longer term commitments here too. They're now like at least 3 year commitments, but we're working towards. The goal is to offer a kid something at 11 years old that stays with them until they're at least 16.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, thank you, Jacob. I'm going to go out of sequence here, so Drew, just hold on for a second. I'm going to go back to Matty, if that's okay. And Matty, I mentioned earlier in your introduction that you were had a 2-year football scholarship at a professional club, and I wonder if you look back at that time, and now knowing what you now know, is there any education and mentoring that you wish had been provided for you as a young player that you now offer players to help them develop?
Yeah, sure. I think, as I touched on earlier, the football world can be quite closed environments, and I was quite fortunate in that my family had already been involved in football business for a number of years, and during that time they gave me some much needed insight as to what could be expected on the football scholarship. I'll go back to what I said before as well. Essentially, it's the overall understanding of the player's needs what are important here. So for things to work well between the advisor and the player, there has to be a strong relationship of trust. That trust has to be strong enough for the advisor to deliver some truths from time to time. The advisors and the players and really support and give guidance on how best to approach the clubs, particularly to discuss planning around discussions and pathways for players to hopefully reach first team football. So whilst we encourage the players to take responsibility for their own development, with our younger players, we can take a more hands-on approach sometimes and arrange more formal channels of communication with the football clubs. So yeah, again, learning and understanding the players' ambitions and what they want for the football is really crucial to our advisory role in helping players. And our work here is really to help players focus on what they can do to best achieve the targets. And touching on what Jacob said earlier, what we try our best to do is help the players recognise early on what the club expects of the player in line with the culture and ethos at the club. We think that's really important if the player is going to achieve what they want to achieve. And we try and widen the player's viewpoint and the parents' viewpoint sometimes, because they're not always seeing things from, like Jacob said, the helicopter view. They're sometimes looking at it just from the viewpoint of the club that they're at. So we're trying to really expand that knowledge for them, and every player is different, every family is different, and we've got to adapt our style and approach sometimes. In terms of the actual mentoring and managing the players, every player situation can be different, so they can expect different levels of contact time. For example, like our work with a player at 16 years old can be very different to when a player is up and running with his career later down the line. So other considerations can be as a player ideally progresses through the system, and the overall ambition is for us to help them stay in the system to reach first team football and have careers playing professional football. Is sometimes on the way they have to think about what decisions they can make. This can be like going out on loan, or if they have to go on transfer to another club as part of the development to search for first team football. And if that does happen, we have to help the families and the player with this transition and make sure that they're comfortable with the new arrangements, which can be the new accommodation or the new football environment. So there's quite a few things to think about along the way in the early phases of player representation. So I hope that's provided a bit of insight into our work with young players.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. It's interesting. I always have my coach's hat on and think about everything that happens on the training field and the on match day, etc. But it's clear that it's a more holistic and wider journey with lots of people positively impacting. Hopefully, thank you, Maddie. Right, Drew. If your last question was a big one, this is massive. So yeah, you get yourself ready. What do you think an ideal talent ID and development framework looks like? That's the massive part. And if that isn't big enough, I'm going to add an extra bit in there as well. And I'm really interested in where a grassroots coach fits into it.
All right. So I think I'll start by saying it's probably not an ideal one that's out there at the moment, or it's a very well guarded secret. So you talked before about, say, Bayern Munich, and they've got rid of the 10s and 11s, but then you look at, say, Manchester City, and they're driving down into a younger age group. Jacob's talked there about under 11 being a starting point for Neuseeland, but then there'll be another one that'll be earlier later. So I guess, and the other piece is, we sometimes go and look at, well, let's take this player as an example. So lots of people will point to like a Jamie Vardy or a Harry Kane as an example of why early sort of ID doesn't work necessarily. But then I guess for every one of them, there's like a Phil Foden who's been in an academy and gone there. So, it's really nuanced to what it looks like. But I guess as a general thing, I'd say, it probably does need to be, so identification needs to be exactly that, like a framework or a network. So it would be interconnected to find the right environment at the right time, to find the stretch and support for all the individuals that might be within whatever it looks like. So a bit there that Jacob's talked about kind of resonates there, I guess, around it. Well, there's lots of different places, and there's links between different parts of the footballing ecosystem where and that talent isn't probably just you're talented or you're not. There's different levels of it. So the Sport Australia framework that came out a little, the FTEM framework, had sort of 3 levels of talent before you get to elite, before you get to mastery. So it might be that talent's going to kind of work its way through, and it's not until you become super talented that then you can participate in an elite level, then master it. So I talked a few weeks ago about that concept, maybe less of a ladder, is more of a jungle gym. So we like everything to be nice and linear, but when we know that development's not linear, it probably doesn't make sense to have a fully linear pathway. So I guess the idea would be, ideally, you'd have a link that links, and I'll take an Australian, but I know they're sort of doing some similar things in Germany as well, and I'm sure lots of other. So linking professional clubs, federations, and then sub-elite, and then down into grassroots football. So identification's done long-term rather than just being on current ability. So we've got a pretty bad, at least in Australia. This kind of idea that identification takes place in like 2 weekends in October when kids come to a trial, and that's not talent identification. That's just, let's look at them at a time and point. And talent, I guess, needs to account for the 4 pillars. Has been talked about a bit there, and the reality is, I don't think you can probably see some of the skill-based things and some technical, maybe some tactical, probably some physical, but how you're going to dive into a potentially talented player's social and psychological makeup and potential, if you look at them in one game or even just a couple of games, I'm not sure. So we sometimes just jump from kind of detection of potential talent to selection of them, and maybe miss out on what identification actually looks like. And then when you come across the development stage, I guess it's accounting for players moving maybe between environments. So rather than picking them up and moving them up through whatever talent system or pathway looks like, potentially stay connected to where there's some kind of, I guess, psychological safety and also ability to develop there, and then they maybe touch up into higher levels before they make a move. So again, where Jacob said there around that, there's some grassroots clubs that house some players, and then at a stage they'll move to the actual academy. That probably resonates with that as well. And then also, I think probably needing to know about sort of the ideas of biobanding. So there's some different stuff around that, but potentially within competitions, that's going to be extremely hard. But within training environments, it's probably something that needs to be looked at more in terms of developing players, so that they're having some development against people of the similar chronological age, and then some against players with the same physical age. And that's certainly something that we've been looking at in our space. And then I guess the final bit's probably to develop them for what the future looks like, and not just for now. So I guess within our space in New South Wales, we're trying to move in that talent space, having different regions, and then people within those regions that are coaching some players within that region, but also establishing a network down through clubs and associations, so that talent ID is taking place all the time. And then rather than players maybe coming into a talent program and they're in for a year, and therefore that's selection, and other players are deselected from it, maybe move into a space where you say, well, within what we do, let's just bring them in for a limited amount of time. So that might be 10 weeks, 20 weeks. For some, it's going to be long term, but if it's too much, maybe they come back out and others come in. And then at a point, you probably go, right, now that they've hit that ceiling, they can progress to the next level. So I guess having a bit of some other bits to it there. And then I guess the final bit would be, well, given how much we know about RAE, and we'll start to look at where people's quarters of birth are. So if there's somebody and you're saying, well, they're good, but they're not there yet, we'll actually know when they were born, know what their background looks like, know how they train, know what they're going to look like. And maybe it can start to fill out the picture for us, rather than just what we see at a time and place on a football field, where what we kind of perceive to maybe be identification is in fact us just seeing a player that looks better than everybody else because they might be older, or they might have just trained for longer, or they might just be having a really good day. And I guess where it comes into it, and the second part of your question there around grassroots is, well, the whole system's got to be interconnected, but the biggest part of it, I guess, in many ways, is we need the more players that stay in the game, the bigger the potential talent pool. So if players are not having a great experience because of trying to be pushed through a pathway, or whatever their grassroots experience might be, if they're out of it, there's absolutely no chance that they become a highly talented player. So the more that are in, and I guess that in the end, it's probably, for me, just comes down to a thing of, well, probably should treat every player as potentially talented until proven otherwise, rather than the other way around, where we just try and spot the diamond. There you have it.
Yeah, true. Good stuff, mate. Really appreciate that. Loads to delve into, and you'll get a chance to delve into it very soon in the breakout rooms. And as always, you take the direction of the breakout rooms, whoever you want to be, whichever way you want to go. Probably the person with the toughest job now is Warren. Warren, you're going to, I always say briefly summarise some key messages, so that people are really focused when they go into those breakout rooms. What's sort of some of the main takeaways for you so far?
Yeah, incredibly difficult to summarise it very, very quickly, and frantically writing down notes as always. What's really good about this one is the crossover between each of the individuals on the panel, and what they bring to the table in terms of providing a framework for the individuals to support what that collective effort is, regardless of whether you're working in Denmark, in the UK, here in Australia, etc. But just some of the things that I've taken out here is that it's getting around or understanding, identifying players with potential, and then what is that recruitment model? What does it look like? Talent alone is not going to be enough, and then understanding the differences between identification and selection, and how critical parent education is, and also the parent education, not only that, but the player education and the off-field education to support them on their journey, and understanding that it has to be about the individuals, and then managing them as individuals to be able to manage themselves, and that's just as important on the field as it is off the field, as it is on the field. The concerning reality is most of them don't get assistance until they actually have a problem. So the great thing with this one and with what Matthew was saying is that we're putting a framework together to support them. Potentially they might run into these problems, but they're best prepared if they do run into a problem. They've had that education to support them getting through that issue off the field, whatever it might be. And then again, just investing in potential. It's a long-term process, and understanding how you're actually going to support them along their journey, and everyone as an individual develops at different rates. Where's their bar? Understanding how high that bar needs to be, and then supporting them through the different stages of development that they're actually in. And just to cap it off there, every player has their own journey. What stretch and support do they need to provide? Them as individuals will be completely different potentially, or it might be similar, but don't just pigeonhole players. But it's all around that off the field education for both players and parents to support them on their journey, and hopefully keeping them involved in the game. Doesn't matter what level that they're at, they still have a love for the game because of the environment and the experience that they've actually had as part of their journey.
Mate, that's an outstanding summary. You must be writing loads there. Really good job. Really appreciate that, Warren. That's great. Look, I'm going to share my screen. And yep, we can see that. Warren, can you see the screen?
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So we're going to go into the breakout rooms, and as I've already said, ignore the suggestions on that slide if you want. You take it whatever direction you want. Some logistics when you get in the breakout rooms. Put your video on, put your mic on, introduce yourself, have a chat, have 2 minutes talking about whatever, the weather, football coming back, whatever it might be. Then if you can, would like you to start thinking about some of the stuff that's been discussed today. And I know there's a lot that we've thrown at you. So just a guiding sort of task really is, in your group, just make a list. Don't need to write things down, but make a list of things so that might be coaches, that might be the broader football family, that might be the country. But make a list of things we need to stop doing and things we need to start doing even more, start doing better, start doing differently in order to produce a greater pool of talented players. And I know there might be some people from Australia in the room, some people from the UK, people from America, et cetera, et cetera. So it'd be interesting to get different people's perspectives. What I'm going to do now, if that's okay, is I'm going to ask for a couple of people just to take charge and just give a brief summary of the discussion, whether it was the stuff you agreed on, the stuff you disagreed on, or whatever it might be from your rooms. I love this part because it gives us a chance for to find out what's been happening. Right, I've just had an update from room 7. I don't know if this is a stitch up at all, but apparently Chris from room 7 is going to talk. Chris, you there?
Yeah, absolute stitch up.
Well, we go with that in the coaches club. That's perfectly acceptable.
Thanks, fellas, and a wonderful group they were too. Don't ever put me back in there again. No, good boys. We talked mainly about the difference between Australia and the UK because we had 2 boys from myself and Joe from Sydney, Melbourne, and 2 boys, one from Brummie and one from Portsmouth, so very split apart. The main differences we found was the costs involved in actually getting to play. So even when good players get identified, especially here in Australia, they get identified for the state squads. I know way back when they used to still have to pay to participate. And the costs are very different. And obviously that has an impact. If you've got a Maradona in your system in the UK or in Australia, it's going to be very hard for them to play if they can't afford to play. So we talked about that. We talked about the academy, the Cat 1, 2, 3 system in the UK, and that professionalism around that. That's probably not as prevalent here in Australia yet. And that's mainly, again, a funding type issue, because obviously Cat 1 academies are to a degree bankrolled by the larger clubs. And again, financially, it's difficult to do here in Australia. So the controllables are difficult. To answer your questions, Gareth, there's a lot you can control, but unfortunately most of it you can't. And because if again, in my view, in Australia, if you cut out that funding, it's got to come from somewhere. And at the moment, I'm not too sure where that exists. Whereas in the UK, they do have a larger base. So we spent a lot of time sort of discussing that and the difficulties that brings for kids.
Chris, brilliant. Nice to have that opportunity to have that comparative study and conversation. Really good, yeah. And we hadn't really touched on sort of costs to be in the talent development space. So thank you very much for that. Okay, I think room 5, Rocky, you were nominated by your group.
Hello.
How you doing?
Yeah, good. And yourself?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Rocky. So what was some of the main discussions in your room?
Yeah, so we were all talking about grassroots football and early specialisation and early selection. So we've touched on that with the panel as well, and just trying to build that participation. What stood out for me, Frank mentioned it was just keeping it simple for the kids and not overdoing it. Generally, from a perspective of parents. And what we can't control is how parents behave. So we had a discussion because we're very similar, Australia and the UK. A lot of similarities. Here in Australia, we've got obviously the SAP program, and even within clubs, selecting kids at an earlier age and putting them into best teams and that kind of thing. We know that the UK is now opening that up, and some clubs are now selecting kids at even a younger age. So allowing kids just to play the game, so that and not worrying too much about how much we impose ourselves as coaches on the kid at an early age. Jacob mentioned under 11s is where they start. We've got the Dutch FA now looking to do something similar to what Bayern Munich doing. So that early selection in most parts seems to be a big talking point. So we discussed that, but I guess overarching point was keeping it simple and just allowing the kids to learn, and they will, and not being worried that they won't. And if they don't have that specialized coaching at a young age, pretty much.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Rocky. Look, it's a difficult one, the role of the grassroots coach, and probably the only thing I know is that it's important. I'm not exactly clear on my thoughts on exactly where it all fits on, apart from that it's really important and crucial because it's that early introduction that Drew was talking about. Great, thank you.
Yeah, driving. I was just going to say, I think we might make it a bit. I don't know if we make it, but parents make it a lot harder on themselves, trying to overthink what they do with the children. But if the kids are enjoying themselves and loving the game, they're going to develop. Yeah,
no, not nice end for your summary there. Thank you, Rocky.
Thanks,
Chris, any quality questions in the chat that you'd like to? Because our panel have had too much of a rest. Let's get them working again. Any questions for them, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. We got so Stuart Meany has got a question for Drew. So Stuart, if you just want to unmute yourself and unvideo.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey Stuart, thank you.
Yeah, just touch on something that I think all the panelists could talk to, but Drew mentioned it, is the idea around the talent needs trauma. And I think Drew mentioned possibly, getting cut as a 13-year-old from a team might inspire that player to develop themselves more and kind of become a better player because of that traumatic event. Is that what you're alluding to? And what does the kind of research say around about that? And how do you frame that when you're thinking about talent? And to anyone on the panel as well, that could be interesting.
Yeah, so starting point is it's not necessarily something that I have a massive amount of knowledge of, but look, there's some research around it. So there's a guy called Dave Collins who's done a lot around this stuff out of the UK, some other people as well. But basically the concept is that for very few players that there'll be a linear pathway. Like you grow up, you're a kid from a really nice background, you've got everything in the world, you go down the local club, you're 7 years old, at 9 you get ID'd, happy days, now I'm at Man United, I work through, make the first team, thanks for my 200 grand a week, and I play a career, right? But that's like the dream like pathway. So along the way there's going to be like the bumps and bruises, and I guess where it resonates with me is the piece of, well, for everything that we potentially do or change, there's always like the intended consequences of anything that's done, but there's also potentially the unintended consequences. So if you go to a space where players are, not coming in, or they are coming in, or what age do you go to? What's the other bit that might get lost for some of them along the way? So if you're somebody that's struggling to make it in, I think in my mind, there's probably some talent that actually needs the grind of wanting to get there. So some people talk there, like, so Chris mentioned like the cost thing, for instance, but no doubt cost is an issue in Australia, but I also think there's probably a way that real talent will fight through it and find a way. Like there's definitely some kids that are scholarshiped into NPL clubs. You can go to a national championships without paying for it. You can find the way. There's programs like some that you've been involved in, like Football United and stuff, where players can come through, and then maybe they can dive across. If it was cost is a barrier, identification is a barrier, then I think it would be much more linear. So they come from lots of different bits, and then also another bit that I sometimes think about is, so, it gets thrown up here a lot about, well, look at like street football in a lot of countries. So we don't have that because everything's too cushy. Well, is it street football, or is it actually maybe the upbringing that goes with it? So if you go, and I don't have any, I'm going to go anecdotal here, but I'm going to say that if you come from, say, some South American countries where everyone points to street football, I'm still going to say it's highly likely that the ones that make it probably aren't the ones that are the millionaire Brazilian families, for instance. It's still ones that come from maybe trying to get somewhere. So it might not just be the style of football, etc. It might actually be like that real grind to want it. So that becomes something. And then the final bit would be, and I think there's some evidence around this, that it's not necessarily needing, like, you don't need a massive trauma or something, but it's the psychological bits, that some of those characteristics that people bring to it. So they start to actually be able to develop some characteristics that are going to take them through some of the challenges that they face down the way. Because if the first time you really face adversity in a club is when you're 16 and it's, well, perform in this game or you're going to get cut, and you didn't go through anything earlier, are you really set up? And our players actually just going to, come back out? And we had a little discussion in the room that I was in there, like, about, well, there's lots of players that feel like they're permanently on trial. And then at some stage they're going to, because it's like, well, I've got to get that next spot. I've got to get the scholarship at 16. I've got to get signed at 18. And then, so the pressure of it. And then I guess it also leads me into this thought where you go, all right, well, we talk about networks for players to wind up in the talent program, but is there also, say, a support network on the way back out? So rather than players being cut, and it's like, see you later, and they potentially jack the game in or just go like drop down, it's like, no, we'll actually find you the place that you're going to go. So it might be that you come out of a level of wherever it would be. And if we take the UK example, just because we was talking about it in the room there with John and Jamie, that maybe it's all right, well, you're going to get cut from a club at League One, but rather than just being cut at 16 and see you later, it's all right, now what we're going to suggest to you is you go down, and Gareth Long's the coach in the Evo stick at this club, and he'll look after you, and you'll actually play there and play first team football and come in and train with us once a week. So maybe then we don't cut people, and that's the end of the journey. Maybe we stay connected to them, and in that way yes, they're going to go through these small traumas, but maybe we can give them a better support network for what that might be able to look like to bring them to, or to keep them in the pathway. So I'm not sure if I've answered you there, but I've given it a fair old ramble.
Yeah, that was great, Drew.
Sorry,
go on, Jacob.
Is it possible I can jump in and give an answer from our perspective as well? First of all, hello, Stu.
Hey, mate.
It's great to see you. Stu and I know each other and have known each other for a very long time. So, so from our perspective, when we're recruiting, and this question was specifically around the role of trauma, and I'd just like to flip that word slightly. When we're recruiting, especially in Africa, we're looking for 3 factors for selecting an area where we've got a high probability of finding somebody who's going to be a pro. And those 3 factors are population density, access to deliberate practice. So are there enough football pitches per square mile, and therefore the kind of street football experience that Drew was just talking about, and adversity. And when we say adversity, what we're talking about is essentially the area experiencing high enough levels of poverty. And the reason why we look for that is because we find that kids that come from those areas have qualities that some of the kids who don't come from those types of experiences don't have. And those qualities manifest in one very particular outcome, and that is purpose. Do you have a why to play the game that goes beyond scoring a goal or winning a game or getting a salary? And those players that do have that purpose, they're demonstrably, and now we're starting to kind of like systematize that and measure that, they're demonstrably and measurably more driven to succeed than the players who don't come from that type of backgrounds. So I don't know if like trauma is the right word, but adversity is a key factor in developing talented football players who go on to make it as pros.
Yeah, can I just dive in?
Sorry, guys. Go on, Drew.
Sorry, I'll do one more thing. So that talent needs trauma comes from some papers and some evidence. But the other one, and I wish I knew where I got it from, but it's going to be from a podcast I've listened to in the millions I've listened to. But it was talent needs perspective. And that might be a better way of looking at it. So they need like a perspective of where they've come from and where they're going to, and that might be a better word, because trauma gets a bit like they need to have been in a car crash or something really serious. Whereas, so like you say, some adversity or perspective might be a much better term. So agree with that.
Thanks, Drew. Matt, were you adding something there?
Yeah, just from our side in terms of the work we do with clubs, from our experience, there are trends with where players are being found, if you like, where clubs are looking, and we've done a lot of work in the Paris regions, and also another area which is quite a popular one is Lisbon. So just linking in with what the guys were saying, really, in Europe more so about, you can go through the years and find different areas of Paris, for example, that have produced some of the superstars that have gone on to play for the French national team that have arrived in the Premier League. And if you did a study, some areas of Paris produce more players than other areas. So I think that goes on to a little bit of what Jacob and the guys were saying.
Yeah, thank you, mate. Chris, that was a good question. That got everyone going. Have you got another good one like that?
We do. I'm going to go to Aaron from Plymouth. Aaron, if you want to unmic yourself and come on.
Thanks, Chris. It's predominantly aimed at Jacob. He may have already answered some of it in that kind of debate that ensued just then. So based on what Drew said earlier about how there's some birth biases for players that are selected for representative teams, born earlier, etc. One of the best studies I've seen recently is one by David Mann on the way in which they use bibs to age order in terms of talent selection. But for Jacob in particular, is there a particular method that you use currently that helps you to identify players who perhaps don't necessarily shout when we see the obvious on the pitch, so pace, power, to help you determine whether this person in time might actually grow into the type of player that you would like to see?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Aaron, and I'm going to answer it in a very general terms, because the specific knowledge on things like age and stuff like that, I don't have it. But what I can tell you is that the physical attributes on player development and in recruitment are one of the lowest priorities within our recruitment model currently, especially when we're recruiting in West Africa. Again, just going back to this, our recruitment experience and talent development experience in West Africa versus the Nordics is so different. They're dealing with completely different social issues, dealing with completely different educational models, grassroots club models. It's just completely different. So there are some things that are not the same, but broadly we minimize that. And what we do instead is we kind of try to control the controllables, like what are the things that we can know more about. And so we've begun to systematize things like the site. Of course, it's relatively easy now to systematize things like time spent on the ball and like number of touches, the amount of time it takes to shift the ball on successfully, all of those sorts of things. But they've now begun, even at 11 years old, when you go to the kind of very top of the academy pyramid structure that we kind of see ourselves close to, with the Ajaxes and the Athletic Bilbao's, Barcelona's, Chelsea's, Manchester City's. You can now systematize even things like scanning and like scanning time so taking out the subjective elements and controlling as much of the objective ones as possible is super important in that, so that if the physics of a player don't work out quite the way, the biologies and so on and so forth, or if they're at the lower end of an age group, then you still have controlled enough to make an informed decision about whether to progress with a particular player. And there's one other thing that I'd add to that is the degree to which you are now able to systematize and use technology to control for even the psychosocial elements. So we use games, apps with kids, even in West Africa, to kind of assess their mindset and assess their educational capabilities. So, for example, there's a game that Massachusetts Institute of Technology have developed called KNACK, K-N-A-C-K, and I'd encourage you to go on there and just play it and have a little go, and you'll see when you get your results at the end, you'll get what it's about. And like play it all the way. You need to like set aside about an hour to play it. But do it and then try playing it with some of your players and see what the results come back with. And it is literally a game. It's like the worm game and some other little things that you have to do. But I won't spoil it too much, but play that and you kind of see from that how you can, using platforms and using tech, you can actually begin to control some of these other elements that leave the lottery of, not quite lottery, I know there's ways to predict this stuff now, but the lottery of age-related effects and biology out of it as much as possible.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate that. I'll be going on that. Was that for my spelling? Was that K-N-A-C-K?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And Drew, Aaron was talking about a bib system. Is that something that you're aware of in your role?
Yeah. So we've started using that bib system. So within the sort of talent support program. So we've got like 5 teams, and they come in and then play against some of the professional club academies, and they're all in one place at one time on Monday nights playing all these series of games. But we do exactly that. So rather than shirt numbers, we did away with that and went to so everybody comes in with a blank shirt, so players can come in and out of the program is one part that makes it easy. But then everybody that is on the field is in order of date order. So if we have a changeover in the cohort, or you're playing up into a different age group or whatever, then or the group changes, that would always be numbered. So when you are sort of standing up there and having a watch of the game, it's a really easy way to go, oh, wow, if they're number 18, that means they're the youngest player on the field. So that particularly if somebody's come in and they don't know the players and they're having a look at it, it just gives that extra level. And tried it before in some other environments as well around when doing trials and things like that. And I think it's it's certainly not a foolproof system, but it's a very easy way to tell whether somebody is, are they, well, look at them, they're massive, but if they're if they're like a fourth quarter born or a December birth, well, maybe they are going to be massive. But if they're a 1st of January, because they're the number 1 on their back, they're probably a lot older. So if they're clearly physically dominating their opponent, and their opponent's in number 18, then you're probably going, well, that's going to be a January and a December. So we need to take that into account in terms of where they're at.
Yeah, brilliant. I think one of the best bits of advice I had around that was your register, or your role, as they say in Australia, was normally we do it by alphabetical order of surname, don't we? And just do it in the order of their birthday was a real simple thing that I would, do all the time now, but never thought of before. Chris, have we got time for one more?
Yeah, we'll go one more quickly. So Michaela, if you want to jump off and ask your question for us.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Cool. Mine's more of I guess a kind of general question, but if looking at football talent, and I mean, it's obviously highly multifactorial, as we've kind of pointed out, but more of from an, I guess, objective point of view, do you think that the level of contribution of physical, technical, and tactical competence actually has, I guess, an equal contribution to match performance over the talent pathway or over the development process? Or do you think that, is there a different level of contribution of each of those, so physical, technical, and tactical, to match performance throughout development?
Okay, who wants to jump in? I think probably Jacob might have answered this a little bit on his Psychosocial, but happy for anyone to take that one on. Probably one for maybe for Drew or Jacob.
I'll give it a whirl. I think probably the simple answer is it's going to depend on the player, and what they look like. So I think. So are you sort of saying, like, at a younger age group, one of those might be more important than
yeah, sorry. So obviously, yeah. So obviously very individualistic, but from like a general point of view, do you think that maybe physical performance measures are more important to match performance from a younger age, and that's when our kind of relative age effect comes into play? And then as we get older and through the development pathway, the technical and tactical becomes more important, or it contributes more to match performance.
Sure. So I think potentially counterintuitively, but I think a lot of people perceive physical to be more, because it's obvious at a younger age, smaller field, if you're super physically advanced and you can make it from one end of a 7-a-side field to the other in 5 strides, and all the other little kids are still chasing, then it appears very big, but it's probably not that important in terms of the long term. And then I think probably the physical piece starts to become more important later, but it's probably not as evident then. And when you look at the actual running speeds and the physical output of players who are playing at the very top level, it doesn't look that fast when it's on a television, but when it's actually happening and when you see the numbers, it's massive. So they're sort of moving to a space where the game at the highest level, I think, really does require athletes as well as footballers. But that a big part of it is that, well, what somebody may or may not look like at 10 is probably not going to be what they look like at 16 or even 22. And there's that real piece around that physical development piece. It can come on very suddenly and late. But if you don't get it, I think you're really struggling, I would say. And I feel like the more the game moves towards a space where the game can be, played on, like, you look at the breakneck speed of some counter-attacks and things, and that's probably just the way football evolves, that as things have become more tactical and disciplined defensively, players who have the ability to be a game breaker, and one of the things that can really break a game open is speed, particularly, say, on the counter. And that starts to become something that becomes more and more important. And then potentially the way to counter that is going to be that all defenders are going to be have to deal with that. So it can kind of cycle, and it might cycle back. But at the moment, I think we're at a space where the physical piece is big. But I think generally, the football world looks for it way too early, would be my 2 cents.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Drew. Thank you for the question, Michaela. I appreciate that. Look, we always say this has actually been one of our longest discussions. We did say at the beginning it was a massive topic, and certainly that's been proved to be true. What's going to happen now is I just want to wrap up a couple of things, and then if people want to stay for a little bit longer, that's absolutely fine. Matthew and Jacob, we really appreciative of your time. So you're more than welcome to stay, but don't feel that you have to. But before I thank you, I just want to cover a couple of things here. As always, the lads are doing a great job with their podcast in the technical area. Drew, as soon as you're already unmiked, have we got who's coming up soon on your In the Technical Area podcast?
David Carney came out tonight. So former Socceroo, played in the Premier League and played in Uzbekistan and played in the MLS and played with Thierry Henry and went to World Cups, and good listen. So hopefully some people will engage in that.
Excellent. And just a couple of follow-ups. I think I've already thanked people for their contributions on Wednesday night. Absolutely brilliant. And I was really proud of the resource that we were able to put out. Proud in terms of the content. And also thank you to Ben Rollinson, who did a lot of the groundwork there, making it look nice. In my quest to get it out before the weekend, we didn't have time to put them all in the same format, but hopefully people really appreciate the effort that went into that. So thank you everybody that contributed. And if you missed that Wednesday night one, that is one of the recordings that is now up on the ACP channel YouTube account. And massive thanks to Peter Nowakowski for suddenly from nowhere being nominated as our editing man and sound man and everything. So we really appreciate everything you're doing there, Peter, to help us get those up quickly, because you're much quicker and better at it than we are. So I really appreciate that. Okay, so let me just move that slide. Next Monday, the quality keeps on coming. We're looking at analysis for player development. Really follows on nicely from this one. It's that we don't plan it, but it almost looks like we do. And we've got three great panelists. We've got Lydia Bedford, who's England Women's National Head Coach, under 17s. And keeping that international flavour, we've got Kat Smith, who is Performance Analyst with the Matildas, scout for the Matildas in the last World Cup, and also assistant coach, and I've forgotten which Melbourne club, so I'm not going to say it in case I get it wrong. I think it's Melbourne City. Has been assistant coach. I said I wasn't going to say it, and now I have, haven't I? She's assistant coach for Melbourne City as well. So Kat's to confirm, but hopefully she will be able to join us. And completing that excellent panel is returning for the third time our very own Warren Grieve. So we're really looking forward to that one. The following week, coaching players of different ages. We've got some great panelists who are specialists in different phases and ages and stages of player development there. So a nice golden thread running through the webinars coming up. Okay. You can now leave if you want to. But if you want to stay on, then I'll certainly be here for 10 minutes. And we can either carry on a kind of question and answer, or we can put people into a breakout room to carry on conversation. So if you're keen to carry on the conversation and talk to fellow coaches, then by all means stay on. If not, thank you very much for your time. Again, we really appreciate people joining us for these conversations, and we hope that they're helpful. So that leaves me to say thank you to our panel. Jacob, thank you very much for your time, mate. Really appreciate it. Great to see you again. Maddie, thank you again for your time. Really great for us from both of you to get different perspectives across the football world. We've had some excellent coaches on here, and I know both of you have got a good understanding of coaching. You're very humble, saying that you're making it clear that you're not coaching, but you clearly understand that well. But it was great to get perspective. So Jacob and Matthew, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on the webinar, and I'll catch up with you soon. Okay.
Will do. Thank you, Maddie. And Drew, thank you again for representing the Monday Night Coaches Club with such passion and expertise. Thanks, mate.
Always a pleasure.
Okay. Right. So I will give it 30 seconds. We'll see how many people are here, and then we'll decide what we're going to do. I've got to stop sharing my screen, haven't I? That helps. By webinar 10, we'll have this nailed. So guys, if you're staying around, maybe webinar 15, guys, if you're staying around, chuck on your cameras, well, keep your microphones on maybe, but take off your camera so we can see who's still here.
I'm going to stick around for 5 minutes, Gareth, but my bladder's about to burst, so you're going to have to get a minute, right?
Do you know, I'm struggling as well, Jacob. So we could have a 5 minute. We won't have a break. I'll just ramble on for a bit until Jacob comes back. So let's see how many people we got. We got 22 people. Well, look, I think it's a great opportunity if Jacob's staying, Drew's still here, that we sort of ask any questions, additional questions that we've got for Jacob. Drew, Warren's here as well. Warren has massive expertise in this area, and of course we fully acknowledge that there's expertise out there. So please, if people want to answer other people's questions and give an opinion on it, that works well. This is what the club is supposed to be about. So I was trying to fill while Jacob came back, but let's have the question. I can always rephrase it. So anybody want to unmic and sort of ask a question?
Yeah, I might ask one if that's all right, guys.
Absolutely fine. Is that Chris?
Yeah. Hey, everyone.
Brilliant, Chris. Okay, go on then. Ask your question, and then we'll word it to Jacob or Drew.
Yeah. So my question is very much around. I was gonna get everyone's opinion. Hopefully, that the change, and especially when we're looking at the four corners model that comes from the FA, that what's everyone's experience is going from this more technical and tactical point of view for player development through to now this more holistic approach, and what's people's experiences and observations of that, and how do they think that it's benefiting players, but also what challenges do they observe as well?
That's great. So I'll just rephrase that, Jacob, but I think it might be a question for anyone listening as well. The question was a kind of shift from, I suppose, traditionally a physical, technical focus on player development to a more holistic, and you may or may not be aware of the FA's four-corner model, but there's lots of versions of it, and clearly your club has adopted a more holistic approach to player development. And I think the question from Chris was, how have people found that? And of course, some people may not have had the shift. That might be all that some of the younger coaches here know. And then equally, their thoughts and some of the challenges around that. And I'm looking at people, and if no one wants to answer, John Doyle will be answering quite soon around that. But anybody got any thoughts in response to Chris's question there?
I'll have a little one to start with, Gareth, in that I would. So I personally challenge that model, not in terms of those being the things that are important, but in terms of them being seen as pillars that are next to each other. So it'll prompt me to get to share this thing about. I think it's probably better to look as physical, technical, tactical, and more like go with like a Venn diagram, so that overlap each other, and then there's a psychosocial going around the whole outside of it. In the middle of it all is probably the match, and that's where it would be. So yeah, I think it's a really good. Go on, Karen. Sorry, yeah, to have ever separate any of them out, I don't think it makes any sense. So I think you can separate technical, tactical, physical, sure, but the reality is, whether you think you're working on it or not, you're working on psychosocial. Now, you might be working on it in a good way, or you might be cocking somebody up by doing it, but whatever you're doing, you're always going to be potentially having an impact on the psychological and social aspect, I would argue, in everything that's going on. So having an awareness of it, and having at least a baseline understanding of what is good and is not good, and what may be or maybe not a factor that's going to influence whether a player does or does not make it, I would say, the focus has shifted to it, but it's always been there. It's everything we do that encapsulates everything within football. So I would suggest that it's just how much do we know about it, how much do we put into it, and how aware are we of both what we're going to be able to influence and what we might accidentally be influencing at that time.
Drew, I think it's a great point, and I think it was. I think it had a big impact on coaching at its time when it was introduced, and it broadened coaches' minds as to their role and their purpose and what they could influence. But I think probably it is a time for the visual to adapt, so that it's not seen as separate components of player development. Really good.
Can I add something to that? I think one of the things that's been super interesting coming to Denmark and to FC Nordsjælland and understanding from their perspective that I found really different from the English academy model is that four corner model, and then now how it's developed so that the like more holistic piece is in the centre. It kind of starts with this assumption that the coach and the player are still at the centre of it. And that ultimately there are these factors that the coach in their time with the player can affect, that really broadly affect the psychosocial stuff. And actually, that's not really the case, I don't think. And that's something that we've really learned in the comparison between the residential and the model that we have here in Denmark. And rather than, I guess, when you've got the resources, what you can invest in is the people that can make an impact in that time that is not the time spent on the training pitch one-to-one or in group situations with that coach. Because the reality is that's such a small amount of time. It's fundamental to the development of the player, fundamental to them, but it's all this other stuff that's happening around the outside is actually going to shape their career. Stuff that, you know, I mean, parents have come up numbers of times. The amount of work that we do with parents is absolutely huge. And here in Denmark, when we're pitching for a player, and essentially we're pitching for a player, like we are most often, if we find a talented player in Finland, we're going up against Borussia Dortmund, Ajax, clubs like this to sign that player. And we're not pitching to that player, we're pitching to their parents. And that is fundamentally and centrally a psychosocial pitch. It's about how that player is going to be a better person at the end of that. In most cases, it's not about the development of that player and how likely that player is to become a pro, because at the end of the day, these people are parents first and foremost. And so I just think that like there's all this stuff around the outside that is like realizing the limitations of what we do as coaches, you guys do as coaches with players, and understanding that actually the greatest role that can be played is to help kids and young players to understand and develop the tools to deal with the other stuff that's happening elsewhere, not the stuff on the pitch. That's just like, that's massive. And that's the thing that really stood out to me as different when I came here. The Nordics generally, because they have a very tolerant, sensible kind of political and cultural system here, they're quite good at doing that anyway. The school system, for example, is completely different, totally different. It's chalk and cheese to what we have in England. So they're already quite skilled at moving in those circles, but it really struck me as something different.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Gareth, as well, because I think that's something certainly in Australia that we're, and Drew and myself have had this conversation on many occasions with our coach development currently. And if you look at our coach expertise model, and then we've talked about this before on other webinars, where you've got the sort of the vision and philosophy of the club or the environment that you're actually in, and then the football knowledge. So as an individual, what's your level of football knowledge? How big is that level of football knowledge? And then there's 3 pillars, and they are separated into pillars. So we're now challenging, does it need to be pillars? But you've got training, match, and then management. But management's all the way over here. And as you move your way through our current coach development courses, you work on more manage self, manage others as you get to the top end. But we've now started to challenge, maybe we need to shift that, and maybe it needs to come across a little bit more and potentially sit in the middle. Because if you're not able to manage yourself, you're not going to be able to manage others. But then if you don't understand the environments that players coming in, what's their environment outside of football? And depending on the stage of development they're in, what are they experiencing when they're away from football? And football might actually be their release as well. So we see sometimes kids coming in and they might be misbehaving, they might be doing this, that and the other. And we say, oh, they're just not good kids, or this, that and the other. But we have to make sure that we try to find out exactly not just what they are as players technically or tactically, depending on that stage of development, but also like that psychosocial is so important, and understanding what potentially they're going through outside of football that might have an impact on why they're behaving in a certain way. But certainly getting to know your players as individuals, because ultimately that will support you and actually getting better outcomes for them as a collective team. And then certainly now, myself having been in several different technical directors roles, we go through that process now in selecting coaches and what's the type of coach that we want, and how will they fit into our mold, and where are they at. And now for me, the ones that have been through the whole system, earned their stripes all the way at the top, we want them to be working with our younger players, because the level of knowledge that they have, and they're able to engage, but they understand it. So it's a really interesting one, but there's so much to take into consideration. And again, it's a classic one size doesn't fit all, and just trying to put a framework around it to support everyone that's a part of that journey.
Brilliant. Jacob, have you got time for one more question? I don't want to...
Well, yeah, I've got like 5 minutes and then I'm going to run.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's make the most of that then. One final question out there, and make sure the question doesn't take 5 minutes to ask.
Hello.
Hello. How you doing, Theo?
Hey, good. How are you? Just a quick one. What would Jacob say are the key differences at U11 under 11 between the Nordic players and the African players, and like, how does that inform like what you now think about like talent development?
Okay, yeah, it's a really, really good question, Theo. So I'm going to paraphrase what I've managed to learn from the coaches and the director of recruitment, who I'm close to and I work with quite often, in terms of what they would say, but I'm kind of borrowing their words for this. The big things, the two big things that stick out in my mind immediately that I know are really important to them is that, first of all, the players in the Nordics have had access to a lot less deliberate practice than the players who are coming from the West African communities in which we recruit. For example, if you are, the guys have managed to work out that if you're in the Ivory Coast or Nigeria, for example, and you live within a city close to an area of where you can basically play street football or football in grassroots teams with your friends, you are literally clocking up far, far, far more hours of deliberate practice than their Nordic counterparts. And even, I think it was that they showed that if you're in the Ivory Coast or Ghana or Nigeria, you're clocking up far more deliberate practice than you are in Ghana. So like there's differences within regions as well, that basically that there is a lot more play. So you're developing a very technical basis, a technical foundation upon which to build moving forward. The second thing is, in terms of life experience, the kids in West Africa are having a lot more, let's say, they're facing a lot more adversity. And, you know, to borrow the word that Drew was using from the study, I know it's not your words, Drew, they've had, in some cases, a lot more trauma and a lot more life experience. And essentially, they've had to grow up a lot quicker. So some of the things that would make them children, they've kind of been forced, unfortunately, out of that opportunity to feel that way for the length of time that you would in Europe. Whereas in the Nordics, I mean, this is like, in comparison, this is like the land of milk and honey, you know? I mean, kids don't go to school here they don't start school till they're 6. They play until they're 11 years old. My kid's 8 now. He basically just goes to school and plays every day. That's how they do it here. You don't do an exam until you're 14. So like you know, there's a massive difference in terms of the pedagogical model, right, in each of those two different places. And so when the guys then are bringing kids in on the residential model to the academy in Ghana, and some of them are coming from quite far away, so they're moving at 11 years old, and they're moving, it can be a really traumatic experience for them. They're moving to a residential academy. They're switching countries in some cases. They're leaving their homes in Abidjan and moving to Accra, just outside of Accra. And then they're having to take on a really rigorous, very challenging academic model that prepares them for Ivy League in the States as a minimum. And like, our Nordic kids couldn't do that. They can't do that. They're not ready to do that at 11 years old. So there's like there are some big difference, mainly in terms of deliberate practice and in terms of the cultural and educational experiences that each one have had. But I think the guys would say that if the pathway is there at a young enough age, the West African kids very often have a better platform for success. If the pathway is there, the problem is that that opportunity is not given to them in most cases. So that's why models like ours we feel are so important. But yeah, have I answered your question, Theo?
Yeah, perfectly. Thanks.
If you were going to, let me just throw it back to you. If you were going to guess what the differences are from your perspective, what would you think the differences would be? And maybe frame it, you're in the UK, I guess, right now?
Yeah, and my parents are from Ghana, actually. So.
Are they? Okay, right. Okay.
Yeah, but obviously, like, they had a different upbringing. So they were lucky enough that, like, for example, my granddad was the first university graduate from his village. He was the first person to travel. He went to travel in Australia. So he's obviously had, like, I probably have different experiences from what, like, your kids, you know, in Ghana would have. But I've obviously been out and I've seen, like, some of the levels of deprivation, but I've also seen, like, a lot of free play that you wouldn't see in England. And I imagine that they probably get, you know, to a high level of technical proficiency at quite a young age, the top players, I'd imagine.
Yeah, they do. Absolutely. They really do. And, you know, we're just getting to a point now where we're beginning to see interest in and potentially sell some of the players that have come through the African pathway. And you guys can Google that. There's plenty of kind of like transfer rumors about those guys right now. But so far, we've primarily not focused on, but there's been interest in our Nordic pathway players. But I think over the next 2 to 3 years, you'll see some of our players who've come through from the Ghana, the academy in Ghana. You'll see them go to some quite big clubs. And good luck to them. They're great people. That's the biggest source of pride for us, is that they've been through this kind of purpose-driven model for 8 years, and so they're really driven by a why beyond the game itself, and it's really brilliant to see.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Theo.
I'm so sorry, but thanks so much for all the questions. I've really enjoyed participating in this. And
Jacob, look, I want to say it's great to see you again, and it's great to see that your interest in human development is still influencing you even at that elite level. And thanks for giving us, who are trying to do some of the things that you're trying to do, you've given us some evidence, you know, so rather than just saying, well, it can't be done, we've got some evidence that it can be done. And I think that's really important. So I know you're running, but I wanted to say thank you properly. Thank you, Jacob.
I'm glad to hear that. Thanks, mate. And thanks all. Good luck, everybody.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you. Right, guys, we will see you all. I'll tell you what, has everyone else noticed Darren in the corner there doing his decorating? I think I might be hiring you, Darren. I appreciate that.
I'm so sorry, I forgot to turn it off. Sorry.
No, it's been brilliant. I've been critiquing your work. I tell you, you've missed a bit in the top right, mate.
I hope not.
No, we thank you for staying, Darren. We thank you for staying.
No, guys, I'm on most weeks working as well because of the time it is in the UK. So, yeah, it's great every week. It's brilliant, fantastic.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. We'll see you in a different room next week. Cheers, mate.
Yeah, cheers.
Guys, have a great rest of your evening or your day, and we'd love to see you next week. And I'll be sending out details about registrations, etc. soon. Thank you very much, guys. Cheers.